The flash was a physical thing, a searing white blade that carved its way through the tinted windows of the town car. Elara Vance did not flinch. She had trained her body, and more importantly, her face, to remain a placid mask of indifference, a skill as crucial to her craft as any Shakespearean monologue. But inside, each pop of the camera felt like a tiny, desperate hammer against the walls of a crumbling career. "Just a few more steps, Elara," murmured Ben, her publicist, a man whose anxiety perpetually manifested as a sheen of sweat on his brow, regardless of the weather. That high, slight smile. Think mysterious allure, not woman being audited. Elara adjusted the strap of her silver sequin gown, a loaner from a designer who was starting to get nervous about her return on investment. The premiere for Kronos Falls was an A-list affair, and her invitation, for a role that amounted to a glorified cameo, was a small miracle Ben had wrestled from the jaws of oblivion. 2 years ago, she'd been the it girl after her breakout role in the indie darling Whisper of Rain. Now, at 28, she was perilously close to becoming a whatever happened to. She slid out of the car, and the night erupted. The cacophony was a familiar beast, shouting photographers, screaming fans, the rustle of expensive fabric, and the clatter of heels on red carpet. She paused, turned, offered the practiced, three-quarter profile smile that had once graced a dozen magazine covers. But the shouts weren't for her. "Elara, over here. Elara, who are you wearing?" The questions were polite, professional, but the energy was elsewhere, funneling down the carpet toward the latest teen sensation from a streaming series. She felt the shift like a change in barometric pressure. She was becoming scenery. Later, at the after-party, swirling a glass of champagne that she had no intention of drinking, the final nail was hammered into the coffin of her evening. She overheard a producer, a man she'd auditioned for just last week, holding court near a glacial ice sculpture. "Elara Vance? Great talent, no question," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But the buzz has gone quiet. The algorithms, they don't lie. She's a risk right now." The word risk hung in the air, more toxic than the cigar smoke wafting from the patio. It was the industry's kiss of death. Ben found her moments later, her posture rigid against a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering city. "Tough break," he said, his voice gentle. "But we're not out. We just need a new angle. Something to get people talking about your art again." "My art?" Elara laughed, a short, brittle sound. "They're not talking about my art, Ben. They're talking about my marketability, which is currently trending toward zero." "Then we change the narrative," Ben insisted, leaning closer. "I heard a rumor today, a weird one, about Julian Croft." The name landed with a dull thud. Julian Croft, the literary world's most celebrated and most notorious recluse. His debut novel, Saunders' Lament, had been a critical and commercial phenomenon a decade ago, a bleak, beautiful, and philosophically dense masterpiece that had captured the postmodern angst of a generation. And then he had vanished. No follow-up, no interviews, no photographs. He was a ghost, his legend growing in direct proportion to his absence. "What about him?" Elara asked, bored. "He's finishing a new book. His publisher, Orion Press, is desperate. They've sunk a fortune into it, but the man is difficult. He refuses to do any promotion. Zero. Zilch. Thinks it's beneath the work." Ben's eyes gleamed with a familiar manic light. "Orion's head of PR, a shark named Cynthia, is pulling her hair out. She needs a miracle, and we need a spotlight." Elara stared at him, a cold dread trickling down her spine. "Ben, what are you suggesting?" "A merger," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A strategic partnership. You need a story that makes you look serious, intellectual, connected to a different kind of prestige. He needs a reason to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the public eye. You start a relationship." The absurdity of it was so profound that for a moment, Elara was speechless. "A relationship," she repeated flatly. "A public one. A few carefully orchestrated paparazzi shots. A romantic dinner. You, the luminous, talented actress, seen on the arm of the brilliant enigmatic author. It's gold, Elara. It gives you a new aura. You're not just another Hollywood starlet. You're the muse of a genius. And for him, it makes him accessible, human, interesting to a whole new audience. It's a win-win. It's insane, she breathed. He'll never agree. Cynthia thinks he might, Ben countered, if it's presented as the only alternative to his precious book sinking without a trace. And you? You'll agree because you're running out of options. The unvarnished truth of it hit her square in the chest. She looked out at the city lights, each one a tiny beacon of someone else's success. She thought of the scripts that had stopped coming, the parts she was no longer considered for. She thought of the girl who had arrived in L.A. with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart full of Ibsen. That girl was fading. "Set up a meeting," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I want to see him. I want to look the ghost in the eye." Julian Croft's world was one of controlled silence. His house, a stark, modernist structure perched on a cliffside in Malibu, was a fortress against the noise he despised. The only sounds were the rhythmic crash of the Pacific against the rocks below and the soft click of his keyboard. He was a man built of angles and shadows, with dark, unruly hair and eyes the color of a winter sea, eyes that missed nothing and invited nothing in. Cynthia from Orion Press was sitting in his minimalist living room, her sharp, tailored suit a violation of the space's aesthetic. She was talking, her words rapid and laced with a panic Julian found both tedious and offensive. "The pre-orders are soft, Julian. The booksellers are nervous. Without a profile, without a story, this book, a masterpiece, I agree, will be stillborn. You can't expect people to just magically discover a 500-page philosophical novel in this climate." "I expect the work to speak for itself," Julian said, his voice quiet but firm, "as it always has." Saunders' lament was a decade ago. Cynthia's composure cracked. The landscape has changed. It's not enough to be brilliant. You have to be visible. He turned away from her, looking out at the endless, gray ocean. He had spent 5 years on this new book, The Architecture of Absence. It was his heart, his mind, his soul, dissected and laid bare on the page. The idea of reducing it to a marketing problem, of having to perform the role of author like some trained seal, made him physically ill. "There is another option," Cynthia said, her tone shifting to one of careful negotiation. "A collaborative effort." She laid out the plan. Elara Vance, the actress. He'd seen her in that film, the quiet one about the rain. She had been good. A rawness to her, an intelligence in her eyes that the script had only hinted at. The proposal was grotesque. A fabricated romance. A performance for the vultures with cameras. "No," he said, the word final. "Julian, think about it," Cynthia pressed. "It's a transaction. Clean, simple. You give her a certain cultural credibility. She gives you a platform. A few months of your life, a few stage appearances, and your book gets the launch it deserves. You can then retreat back into your silence, wealthier and having reached the audience you deserve. It's a pragmatic solution." Pragmatic. The word echoed in the sterile room. He loathed the concept of his art being subject to pragmatism. But he also loathed the idea of the architecture of absence being pulped, remaindered, forgotten. It was a choice between two different kinds of self-betrayal. "I'll meet her," he heard himself say, surprising himself. One meeting. No promises. The meeting was arranged at a discreet, soundproof private club in downtown L.A. Elara arrived first, choosing a seat in a shadowed booth. When Julian entered, he was exactly as she'd imagined, and yet completely different. He moved with a contained, restless energy, his gaze sweeping the room as if assessing it for threats. He didn't sit so much as occupy the space opposite her, a force of nature reluctantly contained. "Mr. Croft," she began, her actress's charm automatically engaging. "Julian," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "And let's dispense with the pleasantries. You need a career resuscitation. I need to sell books without prostituting my principles. This arrangement is a mutually agreed-upon farce." His bluntness was a slap, but a refreshing one. You have a way with words, she said dryly. It's my profession. He studied her, his eyes unervingly direct. You understand this would be a performance? There would be rules. Boundaries. I'm an actress. Boundaries are my job description. This is different. My life, my privacy is not a stage. And my career is not a charity case. She fired back, her own temper flaring. I'm not doing this for fun. I'm doing it to survive. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two wounded animals from different species, forced into the same cage. The air between them crackled with a strange, antagonistic energy. What's the first move? He finally asked, the question of surrender. A paparazzi shot, she said, the plan already formulated in her mind by Ben. We'll be seen leaving a restaurant together. You'll look engaged, as if you're actually interested in what I'm saying. A muscle twitched in his jaw. And how does one do that? You lean in slightly. You make eye contact. You try to forget that the entire thing is a business transaction orchestrated by soulless puppeteers. She gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Think you can manage that? He held her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his stormy eyes. I suppose we're about to find out. The first photograph was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of its kind. Taken outside a tiny, exclusive Italian restaurant in West Hollywood, it captured Elara laughing, her head thrown back, one hand resting lightly on Julian's arm. He was looking down at her, a faint, uncharacteristic smile softening his usually severe features. The lighting was perfect, the composition intimate. It looked real. The internet, as it was designed to do, exploded. Elara Vance's mysterious new man, screamed one headline. Who is the brooding hunk captivating Hollywood's sweetheart? Queried another. It took less than 24 hours for the digital sleuths to identify him. Elara Vance, dating reclusive literary genius Julian Croft. The story had everything: glamour, intellect, mystery. Ben was ecstatic. Cynthia from Orion Press sent a one-word email. Proceed. Their first official date was a walk along the Santa Monica Pier, a location chosen for its high visibility and chaotic energy. It felt like a military operation. Remember casual intimacy? Ben had coached Elara over the phone. Hold his hand. Laugh at something he says. Whisper in his ear. Julian was a statue of tension beside her. He held her hand as if it were a dead fish, his grip limp and cold. You're supposed to look like you enjoy my company, not like you're being led to an execution, Elara muttered through her perfect, media-ready smile. This is a form of execution, he replied, his eyes scanning the crowds for the telltale glint of camera lenses. A slow, social one. Then pretend I'm your last meal, she shot back, squeezing his hand tighter. Indulge. A group of teenagers recognized her and asked for a selfie. As she posed, she pulled a reluctant Julian into the frame. This is Julian, she said, her voice bright. He's a writer. The photo was instantly uploaded, another piece of evidence in their constructed narrative. As they walked towards the end of the pier, away from the worst of the crowds, something shifted. A young woman, maybe a college student, clutching a worn copy of Saunders' Lament, approached them, her eyes wide with a reverence that was entirely for Julian. Mr. Croft, she stammered. Your book, it changed how I see the world. Thank you. Julian stopped. The performative mask he'd been wearing slipped away, replaced by a look of genuine, startled humility. He looked at the book, then at the girl's earnest face. Thank you for reading it, he said, his voice softer than Elara had ever heard it. He took the pen she offered and signed the title page with a quick, elegant flourish. It was a small moment, but for Elara, it was a crack in the fortress wall. She saw the man behind the reputation, not just the reclusive genius, but someone who cared deeply about the connection his words could forge. Later, forced by their handlers to spend a few hours together at her apartment to solidify the narrative for any long-lens photographers, the silence was thick and uncomfortable. Why did you stop? She asked, pouring them both a glass of wine. After the first book, you had the world at your feet. Julian took the glass, but didn't drink. He wandered over to her bookshelf, his fingers trailing over the spines. The world is a noisy, demanding place. It wants a piece of you. It wants to simplify what is complex. I found the noise corrosive. And you don't think that's selfish? The question was out before she could stop it. To have a voice like yours and then refuse to speak? He turned to her, his gaze sharp. And you? Performing for a living? Giving pieces of yourself to a camera for the approval of strangers? You don't find that corrosive? It was a direct hit. It's what I love, she said, but the defense sounded weak, even to her. Is it? Or do you love the idea of being loved? He gestured around her beautiful, sterile apartment. Where's the real Elara Vance in all this? The conversation was getting too close, too real. This was meant to be a business arrangement. The real Elara Vance is trying to pay her rent, she snapped. Something you clearly don't have to worry about. No, he agreed, unoffended. I worry about other things. The integrity of a sentence. The silence necessary to hear the truth of things. They were from different planets. And yet, as they stood there, locked in a battle of wills and worldviews, Elara felt a thrill that had nothing to do with paparazzi and everything to do with the raw, unvarnished challenge he presented. The arrangement worked spectacularly. Elara's name was back in the trades, but now it was coupled with adjectives like cerebral and sophisticated. She was suddenly invited to literary salons and intellectual roundtables. A script for a prestigious historical drama landed on Ben's desk. The director mentioning he'd heard she had a new depth. Julian's book, The Architecture of Absence, shot to the top of the pre-order charts. His publisher was delirious. The mystery of the author was finally being solved, and through the lens of a glamorous romance, it was a story the public adored. Their forced interactions became a strange kind of routine. They developed a system. They would be seen at a gallery opening, exchange a few words for the cameras, and then retreat to opposite corners, communicating through a series of subtle, agreed-upon signals. A touch of the ear meant, I need to leave in 5 minutes. A glance at the watch meant this photographer is getting too close. During one such event, a black-tie fundraiser for a library, they found themselves on a secluded balcony, a temporary reprieve from the performance. You're good at this, Julian remarked, his tone not quite complimentary, not quite an accusation. It's acting, she said, leaning against the railing. The night air was cool. It's what I do. You, on the other hand, are a terrible actor. You still look like you'd rather be getting a root canal. That's because I would, he said, but there was no malice in it. He came to stand beside her, looking out at the city. It's the falseness I can't stand. The reduction of everything to an image. Not everything, Elara said softly. She nodded back towards the ballroom. Your book is in there. People are talking about the words, Julian, the actual words. Because of this. Because they became curious about the man who was seen with me. He was silent for a moment. A distasteful means to a worthy end, he conceded. Welcome to my world, she replied with a wry smile. The turning point came a week later. They were scheduled for a cozy coffee date. The paparazzi, tipped off by Ben, were waiting. But so was a more aggressive, less scrupulous photographer, who stepped directly into their path, his camera an inch from Elara's face, shouting crude, personal questions. Elara froze, the invasive lens triggering a wave of panic. Before she could react, Julian moved. In one fluid, startlingly swift motion, he stepped between her and the camera, using his own body as a shield. He didn't shout or push. He simply stood there, a wall of quiet fury, his gaze fixed on the photographer with an intensity that was more terrifying than any outburst. That's enough, he said, his voice low and lethal. The photographer, unnerved, lowered his camera and slunk away. Julian turned back to Elara. She was trembling, the professional composure she always wore shattered. Without a word, he took her hand, a real, firm, protective grip, and led her away from the scene, flagging down a cab himself, ignoring the other flashing cameras. In the back of the taxi, the silence was different. It was charged warm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "No one should be treated like that," he said, his jaw tight. He was still holding her hand. She realized she didn't want him to let go. That night, the narrative reached a fever pitch. The photos of Julian protecting her were everywhere. The headlines wrote themselves: brooding author I.S. Elara's White Knight, a real-life romance. But for the first time, the narrative felt like it was chasing the truth, not creating it. Something had fundamentally shifted between them. The transaction was becoming complicated. The complication had a name: the Lake Tahoe trip. Cynthia and Ben, sensing the golden goose was laying platinum eggs, decided their couple needed a more intimate setting. A secluded cabin, a weekend. Sources would leak the location to ensure the right photos were captured. The cabin was beautiful, all dark wood and vast windows looking out onto a serene, pine-ringed lake. It was also a pressure cooker. For the first time, there was no immediate escape. No handlers to whisk them away. It was just the two of them, the quiet of the woods, and the unresolved tension that had been building for weeks. The first day was awkward, a return to their initial, stilted interactions. Julian immediately claimed a chair by the fireplace with a book, retreating into his fortress of silence. Elara busied herself with pointless tasks, feeling his presence in every room like a physical touch. It was on the second night, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a bottle of wine between them, that the walls finally crumbled. They'd been talking, really talking, about their childhoods, their fears, the moments that had shaped them. Elara spoke of the constant, gnawing insecurity of her profession, the fear of being found out as a fraud. Julian spoke of the loneliness of his chosen path, the weight of expectation after his first success. "Why this book?" she asked, curled up on the sofa opposite him. "Why the architecture of absence?" He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "It's about the spaces people leave behind, the silence after a door closes, the shape of a memory. It's about my father. He didn't die. He just left, and his absence became a more defining presence in my life than any presence ever could." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Elara felt her heart constrict. This was no performance. This was the real Julian Croft, and he was letting her see him. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're both experts in building architectures of absence. You, with your physical silence. Me, by filling the space with so much noise and performance that no one could find the real person underneath." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "What a pair we are," he murmured. He stood up and crossed the room, not stopping until he was standing before her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips, a touch so tender and unexpected that she stopped breathing. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss for the cameras. It was not part of any script. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly real. It was the answer to a question they had been too afraid to ask. All the practice touches, the stage glances, the whispered lines, they all fell away, leaving only this shocking, profound truth. When they finally pulled apart, the world had rearranged itself. The fake relationship was gone. In its place was something terrifyingly, beautifully genuine. "This wasn't part of the deal," she breathed, her forehead resting against his. "No," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "It wasn't." Returning to LA was like stepping back into a funhouse mirror. The facade was the same, but the people behind it were irrevocably changed. Their public appearances now had a new, electric charge. The way Julian's hand would rest on the small of her back wasn't practiced. It was possessive. The way she would laugh, her head tilting towards him, wasn't for the cameras. It was for him. The press and the public sensed the shift, and their obsession with #Elian grew even more intense. In private, they built a new world. Julian's sterile house began to show signs of life. A sweater of hers left on a chair, a script on his desk. Her apartment gathered quiet corners where he would write while she memorized lines. They were falling in love, and the terrifying, wonderful irony was that the very spotlight they had sought to manipulate was now shining on their most authentic selves. But a lie, once set in motion, has a gravitational pull of its own. The conflict arrived in the form of Thomas Tripp, Pendleton III, a slick, ambitious entertainment reporter for The Verve, a popular digital media platform. He had been one of the biggest champions of their love story, but Tripp was a bloodhound, and he'd caught a scent of something off. Elara and Julian were at the launch party for The Architecture of Absence, a glittering event that was the culmination of all their scheming. The book was a smash. Elara had just been officially offered the lead in the historical drama, and they were, for all intents and purposes, winning at the game they had created. Tripp cornered Elara near the bar, his smile a razor blade. Elara, fantastic party. Julian must be thrilled. It's quite a Cinderella story, isn't it? The reclusive author and the actress, saving each other's careers. It's a story about connection. Tripp, she said, her smile flawless. Is it? He leaned in, his voice dropping. See, I've been doing some digging. A little bird at Orion Press mentioned a strategic partnership. Another one mentioned a very specific meeting between your publicist and Julian's publisher, dated just before you two were first photographed. The timing is quite a coincidence, don't you think? Elara's blood ran cold, but her face remained a mask of polite bemusement. I have no idea what you're talking about, Tripp. Julian and I met through mutual friends. Of course you did, he said, his eyes gleaming. But my source is very confident and very willing to talk on the record. I'm running the story tomorrow. I just wanted to give you a chance to comment. He slid a business card into her hand and melted back into the crowd. Elara stood frozen, the noise of the party suddenly sounding like a roaring in her ears. She found Julian across the room, surrounded by admirers. She caught his eye, and the minute panic in her own was all it took for him to excuse himself and come to her side. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low with immediate concern. She told him, her words a frantic whisper in a secluded alcove. "He knows, Julian. Tripp knows. He's going to expose us tomorrow." Julian's face hardened. The piece they had found was being threatened by the very machinery that had brought them together. "So this is how it ends," he said, his voice flat. Not with a bang, but with a tabloid headline. "We have to get ahead of it," Elara said, her publicist's instincts kicking in. "We can release a statement. Admit to a friendship that blossomed into more. We can spin this." "Spin it." Julian looked at her, and for a terrifying second, she saw the old, reclusive man return, the walls slamming down. "Elara, I am done spinning. I am done performing. I told you from the beginning, the falseness is corrosive. I won't build our truth on another layer of lies." "What are you saying?" she asked, her heart pounding. "I'm saying I love you," he said, the words simple and devastating. "And I won't negotiate that truth with a gossip columnist. Let him print what he wants." But Elara was terrified. An exposure like this wouldn't just end the fairy tale. It would paint them as calculating frauds. Her newfound credibility would vanish. She would be a laughingstock. The fear of losing everything she had fought for, the career, the respect, him, clawed at her. They argued their first real, painful argument in the car ride home. It was a collision of their two worlds, her pragmatism, his absolutism. "You're willing to throw it all away on a principle?" she cried. "It's not a principle, Elara. It's us," he shot back, his voice rising. "Don't you see? If we try to manage this, to control the narrative, we become the very thing we pretended to be. What we have is the only real thing to come out of this mess. I will not let them have it." He dropped her off at her apartment, the silence between them a chasm. She didn't ask him to come up. The article dropped at midnight. Elara read it on her phone, her hands shaking. The headline was brutal. Fake love, real gains, the calculated romance of Elara Vance and Julian Croft. It was all there. The meeting orchestrated by their publicists, the mutual career benefits, the stage paparazzi shots. Tripp had done his job well. The piece was damning, painting them as cynical, manipulative, and desperate. The online backlash was instantaneous and vicious. The public, feeling betrayed, turned on them with a fury. Hashtag fake relationships started trending. The comments on her Instagram were a torrent of hate. Fraud. Desperate. I knew it was too good to be true. Ben was on the phone within minutes, his voice shrill with panic. We need damage control. We'll say you developed real feelings. It started fake, but became real. No, Elara said, her voice surprisingly steady. She had been staring at the hateful comments for an hour, and somewhere in the depths of her despair, a strange clarity had emerged. Julian was right. She was tired of spinning. She hung up on Ben and tried to call Julian. It went straight to voicemail. A cold dread filled her. Had he retreated? Had he decided she was too much a part of the world he despised, that she would always choose the performance over the truth? She had to see him. She drove to Malibu through the pale light of dawn. The paparazzi were camped outside his gate, but she used a service entrance Ben had once secured for them. The house was dark and silent. She found him in his study, sitting in the dark, staring at the now-cold ashes in the fireplace. The advanced copy of his book, which should have been a trophy, sat unopened on his desk. He didn't look at her when she entered. I was wrong, she said, her voice breaking the heavy silence. You were right. About all of it. He slowly turned his head. He looked exhausted, hollowed out. It doesn't matter now. It's the only thing that matters, she insisted, stepping into the room. I was so afraid of losing what we'd built that I was willing to cheapen it. I was willing to lie about the one true thing that has ever happened to me. My career, the fame, it's the fake relationship, Julian. This, she gestured between them, her eyes brimming with tears. What I feel for you is the only real thing in my life. And I am so sorry. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. What happens now? We're a public joke. I don't care, she said, her conviction growing. Let them talk. Let them say whatever they want. I love you. And if you'll still have me, I want to be with you. Not for the cameras, not for a story. For us. Julian was silent for a long time, watching the sun begin to rise over the ocean, painting the gray water in hues of gold and pink. The silence, which he had once found so intimidating, now felt like a shared space, a place where truth could finally live. He turned around. The defeat in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, resolute light. The architecture of absence, he said softly. I wrote about the shape of what's missing, but I was wrong. It's not the absence that defines us. It's what we choose to fill it with. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands. Fill it with me, he whispered. And he kissed her, not as an escape, but as a promise. 1 year later, the Berlin International Film Festival was a world away from the Hollywood premieres of her past. The air was colder, the critics sharper, the appreciation more about the art than the celebrity. Elara stood on the red carpet, her hand firmly clasped in Julian's. There were no frantic screams, just the respectful flash of cameras. She was there for the Glass Bell, a small, German-language film she had fought for, a role of profound subtlety and strength. It was the best work of her life. The scandal of the past year had faded, as scandals do. They had never publicly addressed Trip Pendleton's article. They had simply lived. They were seen together, quiet and unbothered, shopping for groceries, walking on the beach. They gave no interviews. They offered no explanations. Their silence became their statement. And slowly, the public narrative shifted from frauds to enigmatic and finally to just accepted. Julian, beside her, wore a simple dark suit. He was never going to be comfortable in a crowd, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. He was there for her. A reporter from a serious European culture magazine managed to get a question to them. Frau Vance, a magnificent performance. Herr Croft, will your next novel be another long wait for your readers? Julian looked at Elara, a small, private smile touching his lips. He then turned to the reporter. I'm writing again, he said simply. It turns out, silence is not the only place where stories are born. Later that night, in their hotel room, Overlooking the lit spires of the city, Elara leaned against Julian, his arms wrapped around her. The Golden Bear Award for Best Actress sat on the table beside them, a heavy, beautiful thing. You know, she said, her voice soft with contentment, we never did get to have a real, proper first date. Without any cameras. Julian kissed her hair. This is it, he murmured. Every day with you is the real thing. The calculated spotlight had long since dimmed, but in its place they had found a different kind of light, softer, quieter, and infinitely more real. It was the light of a shared life, built not on a lie, but on a truth that had been forged in the most unlikely of fires.